In 1968, a loyal Jehovah's Witness in Sweden was asked a question he believed would be easy to answer. Carl Olof Jonsson was not an apostate or a secret critic of the organization. He was a full-time pioneer who trusted the Watchtower Society and believed its teachings were firmly supported by the Bible. During a Bible study, a man asked him to prove that Jerusalem had been destroyed in 607 BCE. Carl already knew that historians generally placed the destruction 20 years later, in 587 or 586 BCE, but that did not trouble him. He assumed that secular historians were relying on incomplete records, while the Watchtower's date came from the Bible, so Carl promised to investigate and return with an answer. He expected to find evidence confirming what he already believed. Instead, that simple question led him into a 7-year examination of Babylonian chronicles, astronomical observations, ancient business records, and Watchtower publications. The deeper he looked, the more serious the problem became. The year 607 BCE was not merely an obscure date printed in an old religious book. It was the starting point of a calculation leading directly to 1914, the year Jehovah's Witnesses identify as the beginning of Christ's invisible heavenly rule. If 607 was wrong, what would happen to 1914? And what would happen to the loyal elder who discovered the problem? Before we continue, if you appreciate serious and respectful investigations into Watchtower history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Kingdom Wisdom. It helps us continue documenting stories that deserve to be examined carefully. Carl's story is not simply about an ancient date. It is about what can happen when a loyal man asks an honest question and realizes that the answer may cost him nearly everything. Why 607 BCE matters. The Bible describes how Babylonian forces under King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, the temple was burned, the monarchy of Judah ended, and part of the population was carried into exile. For most people, the difference between 607 and 587 BCE may sound like a minor academic dispute. For Jehovah's Witnesses, however, those 20 years carry enormous theological weight. The organization teaches that a prophecy in Daniel chapter 4 has 2 fulfillments. The first concerned Nebuchadnezzar, who temporarily lost his kingship during a period described as 7 times. Watchtower theology gives those 7 times a second and much larger fulfillment. Using a prophetic year of 360 days, 7 times become 2,520 days. By applying a day for a year principle, those days are then converted into 2,520 years. According to the organization, the period began when Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE. Counting forward 2,520 years, while accounting for the absence of a year 0, brings the calculation to 1914. The Watchtower teaches that Jesus began ruling invisibly in heaven that year. It connects 1914 with the beginning of the last days, the establishment of the heavenly kingdom, and the organization's understanding of its own modern role. The calculation appears precise, but its conclusion depends entirely on its starting point. If Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 rather than 607 BCE, the same period would end around 1934, not 1914. There is also an important distinction between a biblical statement and a religious interpretation. The Bible never directly says that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE. That date is calculated through a particular understanding of Jeremiah's prophecy concerning 70 years. The Watchtower interprets those 70 years as a period of complete desolation and Jewish exile that ended after the return to Judah in 537 BCE. Counting backward 70 years produces 607. Many biblical scholars understand the prophecy differently. They argue that Jeremiah's 70 years referred primarily to Babylonian domination over Judah and the surrounding nations. In that interpretation, the period began around the rise of Babylonian power and ended when Babylon fell to Cyrus in 539 BCE. The disagreement, therefore, is not simply the Bible against secular history. It involves different interpretations of what Jeremiah's 70 years were describing. That was the complex question Carl Olof Jonsson had promised to answer. A loyal witness trying to defend his faith. Carl Olof Jonsson was born in Sweden in 1937. He became one of Jehovah's Witnesses as a young man and would spend approximately 26 years actively associated with the organization. He married a fellow witness in 1967. By the following year, he was serving as a pioneer, devoting much of his time to preaching and conducting Bible studies. He later served as a congregation elder. This background is essential to understanding his motivation. Carl was not approaching Watchtower chronology as an outsider. His faith, friendships, and religious identity had been formed inside the organization. He had preached its message, defended its teachings, and encouraged others to trust the spiritual direction coming from the Watchtower Society. When he encountered information that appeared to contradict one of those teachings, his first reaction was not to assume that the organization was wrong. He believed an explanation existed and that responsible research would reveal it. That reaction will be familiar to many questioning witnesses. When a teaching appears difficult to defend, the loyal member may assume that the problem lies with his own limited understanding. He may believe that critics are leaving out important information or that historians are relying on unreliable sources. Carl began from that position. He was not searching for a reason to leave. He was searching for stronger reasons to remain confident. The question he could not dismiss. The turning point came during his ministry in 1968. A man with whom Carl was studying the Bible challenged him to prove the Watchtower's date for Jerusalem's destruction. The man pointed out that historians place the event in 587 or 586 BCE, approximately 20 years later than the organization's date. Carl was aware of the disagreement, but according to his own account, he believed the historical chronology was probably based on defective ancient records. He promised to investigate the matter. At first, he may have expected to consult a few books, identify the weaknesses in the conventional chronology, and return with a clear defense of 607. But that raised questions he had never seriously examined. Why did historians accept 587 or 586? Were they simply copying one another? Did their conclusion depend on one ancient historian? Could 20 years be missing from the known history of Babylon? Carl realized that quoting another Watchtower publication would not resolve the issue. To answer the Bible student honestly, he needed to understand how the historical chronology had been established. His investigation continued periodically from 1968 until the end of 1975. This was long before online databases made academic material instantly accessible. Serious research required access to libraries, specialist books, translated tablets, and scholarly discussions far removed from the reading of an average congregation member. Carl studied the Neo-Babylonian Empire, including the recorded reigns of its kings. He examined historical chronicles, royal inscriptions, astronomical records, and thousands of dated legal and commercial documents. The question was no longer merely, what date do historians accept? It had become, what evidence led them to that date? The Babylonian Chronicle, one important piece of evidence, is a clay tablet known as BM 21946, now held by the British Museum. Often called the Jerusalem Chronicle, it describes events from the early reign of Nebuchadnezzar. The tablet records Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against what is understood to be Jerusalem, the capture of its king, and the appointment of another ruler in his place. This was not the final destruction of Jerusalem. It was the earlier conquest associated with King Jehoiakim, securely dated to 597 BCE. That event provides a vital chronological anchor. Biblical passages connect Jerusalem's final destruction with Zedekiah's 11th year and with Nebuchadnezzar's 18th or 19th year, depending on whether the king's accession year is included in the count. When the biblical regnal information is connected with the Babylonian chronology, the final destruction falls in 587 or 586 BCE. This presented Carl with an unexpected problem. The conventional date was not based simply on historians rejecting the Bible. Scholars had reached it partly by correlating Babylonian records with chronological details preserved in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 2 Kings. The Chronicle did not stand alone. Carl soon encountered another vast category of evidence that made the 20-year difference even more difficult to explain. Thousands of ordinary documents. The ancient Babylonians left behind thousands of legal, commercial, and administrative tablets. These included contracts, receipts, loans, sales records, and other ordinary transactions. The tablets were commonly dated to a specific day and month in the regnal year of the current king. A contract might be dated to the 10th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Another could come from his 43rd and final year. Records would then begin appearing from the accession year of his successor. One isolated tablet might contain an error. Thousands of tablets, however, create an extensive chronological network. The established succession moves from Nebuchadnezzar to his son Amel-Marduk, followed by Neriglissar, the brief reign of Labashi-Marduk, and finally Nabonidus. Nabonidus's reign ended when Babylon fell to Cyrus in 539 BCE, a date accepted by both secular historians and the Watchtower organization. To move Jerusalem's destruction from 587 back to 607 BCE, approximately 20 years must be inserted somewhere between Nebuchadnezzar and the fall of Babylon. That requires more than pointing to gaps in a surviving historical chronicle. A chronicle may omit certain years because the relevant tablet has not survived. But the absence of a chronicle is not evidence that the known kings ruled for 20 additional years, or that unidentified kings occupied the throne. The business documents cover the reigns and transitions in enough detail that inserting 2 additional decades would require a completely different explanation of the entire period. Carl searched for that explanation, but the records did not provide it, and the chronology was also preserved in another place, the sky. The astronomical evidence. Ancient Babylonian scribes carefully observed the moon, planets, and stars. They recorded eclipses, planetary positions, and the relationship between celestial bodies on particular dates. These observations are valuable because astronomical movements can be calculated backward. If a tablet connects several observations with a particular year of a king's reign, researchers can determine which historical year matches the complete pattern. One important tablet is known as VAT 4956. Its opening associates its observations with the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The tablet records numerous lunar and planetary positions. The accepted astronomical reading places that regnal year in 568 and 567 BCE. Counting back to Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year again points to 587 BCE for Jerusalem's destruction. Defenders of 607 have argued that individual observations on the tablet may resemble celestial positions from 20 years earlier. The Watchtower's 2011 articles, for example, highlighted selected lunar observations and an eclipse that it claimed could support the earlier chronology. But eclipses recur, and an individual lunar position can sometimes appear similar in another year. The more reliable test is whether the entire combination of observations, including the moon, planets, stars, and recorded time intervals, fits the proposed year. The established chronology explains the combined observations. Moving the tablet 20 years earlier may produce occasional similarities, but it does not account for the complete astronomical pattern with the same consistency. Carl was no longer confronting one disputed source. Different categories of evidence, created for unrelated purposes, were pointing toward the same chronology. The historical records, the business documents, the astronomical observations, and the biblical regnal information supported one another. For 607 to remain historically possible, the proposed alternative would have to explain why all these records appeared to agree, while also identifying where 20 additional years belonged. By the end of 1975, Carl believed he had reached an unavoidable conclusion. When the investigation changed him. According to Carl, the growing weight of the evidence forced him reluctantly to conclude that the Watchtower Society was wrong about 607 BCE. The word reluctantly matters. His investigation had begun as a defense of the organization. Had he wanted only to find a contradiction, he would not have needed to continue researching for 7 years. But accepting the historical evidence privately created a serious conflict. Could he continue presenting 607 as a biblical certainty after becoming convinced that the available records did not support it? Could he serve as an elder while disagreeing with a teaching connected to 1914 and the organization's understanding of its authority? Carl still believed another possibility existed. Perhaps the men at Watchtower headquarters had never examined the complete evidence. If he organized his research carefully, they might identify something he had misunderstood. If they could not refute it, perhaps they would reconsider the teaching. He did not immediately publish his findings. He first discussed the material with a small number of research-minded friends. He then developed it into a systematic treatise intended for the international headquarters in Brooklyn. In 1977, he sent the manuscript to the Watchtower Society. The manuscript that reached headquarters. Carl's submission was not a brief letter containing a few objections. It was a documented examination of the Gentile times, the history of the interpretation, and the evidence concerning Neo-Babylonian chronology. Raymond Franz, who was serving on the governing body at the time and had worked in the writing department, later described the manuscript's arrival. According to Franz, its volume and the weight of its documentation had a disturbing effect on members of the headquarters staff. He recalled that they were effectively at a loss over how to handle the material. That account is valuable because Franz was inside headquarters during the period. However, it remains his personal testimony after leaving the organization, not an official Watchtower account. The Watchtower has never published a complete internal record showing who examined Carl's manuscript, what each person concluded, or how the matter was discussed behind closed doors. Those details cannot be stated with certainty. What is known is that the organization received the research and did not adopt its conclusions. Carl described a long correspondence that followed. According to his account, the responses did not adequately address the complete body of evidence he had presented. He also said he was warned against distributing or discussing his findings with other witnesses. From an organizational perspective, the private circulation of research contradicting an established teaching could be viewed as a threat to unity. From Carl's perspective, however, remaining silent would require him to conceal evidence he believed other witnesses had a right to examine. The disagreement was moving away from the date itself. It was becoming a dispute over authority, loyalty, and who was permitted to evaluate established teaching. From elder to judicial committee, Carl eventually resigned as an elder and gave up his congregation responsibilities. According to his account, he increasingly came to be viewed as rebellious and spiritually dangerous. There is an important limitation here. The Watchtower organization has not made his full congregational or judicial records public. It is therefore impossible to reconstruct every accusation, every conversation, or the precise reasoning of the elders involved. It would be too simplistic to say that he was officially expelled only because he had proved that 607 was wrong. But the chronology dispute and his refusal to accept the organization's position clearly formed the background to the escalating conflict. By 1982, Carl had spent approximately 26 years as an active Jehovah's Witness. His congregation was not simply somewhere he attended religious services. It was the center of his social life. He wrote that more than 70 of his relatives were associated with the organization, including siblings, cousins, and their families. He understood that separation from the movement could change those relationships permanently. In May 1982, Carl received a summons to appear before a judicial committee in Sweden. According to his account, he wanted the committee members to study his research so that any meeting could address the evidence behind his position. The committee repeated the summons, but Carl concluded that the hearing would focus on whether he accepted Watchtower teaching, not on whether the reasons for his disagreement were valid. He chose not to attend. On June 9, 1982, Carl Olof Jonsson was disfellowshipped in his absence. He appealed the decision, but a second committee confirmed it the following month. His wife did not abandon him, and some witness relatives reportedly maintained contact. His experience should therefore not be exaggerated into a claim that everyone disappeared. Nevertheless, the formal break removed him from the religious community he had served for more than 2 decades. The research becomes a book. Disfellowshipping ended Carl's formal life as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but it did not end his research. In 1983, his work was published as The Gentile Times Reconsidered. Later editions expanded the documentation and responded to new arguments. The fourth revised edition, released in 2004, offered an extensive examination of both the history and the biblical interpretation behind the Gentile Times calculation. Carl did not claim to have discovered the 587 or 586 BCE date. Historians had accepted that chronology long before his investigation began. His contribution was to gather the evidence and examine it specifically against the Watchtower's defense of 607. He also traced the history of the 2,520-year interpretation. Versions of the idea had circulated among religious writers before the Watchtower movement existed. The early Bible students inherited and adapted that prophetic tradition. This history challenged the impression that the entire calculation had been uniquely revealed to the modern organization. It showed that several interpretive steps had developed over time. Carl also continued to identify himself as a Christian. For him, rejecting the Watchtower's chronology was not the same as rejecting the Bible or rejecting God. He believed the problem was a human interpretation being presented with divine authority. Watchtower's later defense. The organization continued to teach 607 BCE. In 2011, the Watchtower published a 2-part series devoted to the date of Jerusalem's destruction. The articles acknowledged that historians and archaeologists generally accept 587 or 586 BCE. They defended 607 by arguing that the biblical 70 years should control the calculation, and by questioning whether the surviving secular records were complete enough to establish the conventional date with certainty. The second article discussed the Babylonian chronicles, business tablets, and astronomical evidence. It suggested that missing portions of the chronicles might leave room for unidentified rulers or additional years. It also argued that selected astronomical observations could support an earlier date. But the article included two important qualifications. It acknowledged that business tablets exist for all the years traditionally assigned to the Neo-Babylonian kings. It also stated that none of the secular experts quoted in the article believed Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE. Academic consensus is not automatically infallible. Historians can revise conclusions when new evidence appears. But overturning an established chronology requires more than showing that ancient records contain occasional gaps or scribal errors. It requires an alternative timeline that explains the evidence more successfully. The Watchtower's defense raises possibilities about missing years, but it does not identify a documented 20-year period that can be inserted into the succession of Neo-Babylonian kings. That remains the unresolved historical challenge at the center of Carl's work. Why his story still matters. Carl's research separated two ideas that witnesses may be taught to treat as identical: confidence in the Bible and confidence in Watchtower chronology. The Bible contains the expression 7 times, but it does not directly state that the phrase represents 2,520 years. It records Jerusalem's destruction, but it does not give the date 607 BCE. It refers to 70 years connected with Babylon, but understanding how that period should be applied requires interpretation. Recognizing those distinctions does not tell viewers what they must believe. It allows them to examine each step rather than treating the final calculation as if it appeared completely formed in one biblical passage. This is why the controversy extends beyond ancient history. It asks what should happen when a member reaches an evidence-based conclusion that differs from an official teaching. Is the evidence allowed to change the interpretation, or must the interpretation determine which evidence can be accepted? Carl entered the investigation believing that research would confirm the organization. When it did not, the central problem was no longer only the date of Jerusalem's destruction. It was whether he could follow his conscience without losing his place in the community. There are ultimately two questions in Carl Olof Jonsson's story. The first is historical. Can the year 607 BCE be reconciled with the complete record of Neo-Babylonian chronology? That question can be examined through documents, astronomy, and biblical interpretation. The second is personal. What freedom should a believer have to follow the evidence when it challenges an official teaching? Religious unity can encourage patience, humility, and respect. But unity changes character when it requires a conclusion to be protected from investigation. At that point, agreement is no longer being produced by evidence alone. It is also being maintained by authority and by the consequences of disagreement. Viewers do not need to accept Carl's conclusions simply because he devoted years to researching them. His book can be examined critically, just as Watchtower publications can. The sources can be compared, the arguments tested, and the unanswered questions identified. But if 607 BCE is historically secure, a careful investigation should make that foundation stronger, not place the investigator in danger of losing his religious community. That is why Carl Olof Jonsson's story continues to resonate. It leaves behind a question far larger than the difference between two ancient dates. If a teaching is true, why should anyone be afraid to examine it?